Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to another episode of our series, the Porch Sessions, a project in the public humanities. In these sessions, we're really trying to just have casual, not scholarly, but just casual conversations with each other, comrades, friends, colleagues, and talk about new work that we've published, new things that have come out, and hopefully this will be accessible to a broad audience, our students, their families, and just the general public, so they can know a little bit about what we do in the humanities. First of all, of course, I want to acknowledge that we are here today on the unceded territory of the Syilx, the Okanagan peoples, and we want to express our genuine gratitude for the hospitality that has been offered to us from those of us who are settlers and newcomers on this territory. And I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Jodey Castricano. Jodey has just finished a book called Gothic Metaphysics, From Alchemy to Anthropocene, and it's put out by Wales University Press. Jodey, full professor in English and Cultural Studies. They teach critical theory, queer theory, the Gothic, critical animal studies, among other things. And their new book unites these interests in a way that is quite fascinating, and I think it may well be what we call a game changer in terms of how we understand the Gothic both historically and in relation to the Anthropocene, which might surprise some of you putting those ideas together. But once you hear a little bit about Jodey's book, I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. One thing I want to note is we're just talking about the introduction. I had an opportunity to read the introduction a couple times. She connects such things as alchemy, quantum physics, Jungian synchronicity, and our understanding of the more than human world. So you can see that we're going to have a lot of interesting things to talk about. So I'm going to turn it over to Jodey by telling you something about this book. The very first sentence blew my mind. It so hit me between the eyes. We stand at the crossroads of change in the history of Western consciousness. And the decisions we make concern survival on this planet. On the one hand, we have an egocentric individualism, and on the other, an extreme collectivism. I just wonder if we can begin to tease out what you talk about so beautifully in the book, about this very different sense of human consciousness between the then of the medieval and the now of the highly individualized sort of sense of me, the purpose of me as opposed to the collective.
What I'm going to have to do even to get up to the point of arriving at the first sentence, which, you know, one of the epigraphs says, you know, the thing about the book is to go from here across the abyss into the thing itself, is that I probably began writing this book somewhere, in my mind, around it's probably 15 years that it has taken this book to percolate and then to make its arrival. And this arrival comes as a function of the work that I've done, you know, in environmental humanities, which brought me to the point of thinking about the Anthropocene itself, which, as you know, is the fact that that humans are now being seen as the force of nature, having the effect on this planet, that it's brought us to moments of crisis that are marked all along the way by scholars, thinkers, activists. The thing about my work in the environmental humanities, which gets us into thinking about our relations, all our relations on this planet, has to do with critical animal studies, which is one way of thinking about some of the reasons for climate change. My thing about this was recognizing that we are all about talking. We are into talking about certain worldviews that have relationship to the land. And I'm talking about indigenous knowledges and how that is set against settler settling, which has been, which has really been going on for about, let's say, 500 years in this context. But what is rarely discussed is what happened to launch settlerism in the way that it did in the history of human consciousness, of what I'm calling, because we also have to wonder about what we mean when we're talking about the human as a category. The history of consciousness, how it is written, and what it means for our relationship to we were talking earlier about living in nature, as if nature is somehow separate from us. And what I found was, with the rise of mathematization of the world, the rise of mechanistic science, the extirpation of animism from the people's, when I say people's, I realize I'm generalizing, but this is what we got. But the extirpation of animism as a way of engagement with the world in which the thing called nature, which now seems outside us, was a living entity and had consciousness. And so there are many forms of consciousness, let's call it consciousnesses, to the extent that the rise of the subject-object divide in mechanistic science, which then created this gap or an abyss between our experience and how we saw the world. The divestment of consciousness and nature or reality, forms of understanding reality as being purposive. And this is where, I had to be careful not to make it sound like I'm talking about woo science, like the Love and Light Brigade. That's not what I mean at all.
Nostalgia for the
medieval. Yes. No, but the thing about the medieval paradigm, if you will, was that it had to go somewhere.
That was so beautiful because, of course, I teach the Gothic very, very briefly in my survey course, but often more in conjunction with the work I do on contemporary women's writing, because the Gothic has meant so much to women, because it's outside the mainstream. It's outside that dominant hegemonic discourse. But you make a lovely argument, which I've echoed, but in very different terms, and that's what I mean. I won't teach it the same, because what you say is the Gothic becomes a repository, as it were, for all that is left out during this scientific, mechanistic worldview as the Industrial Revolution, the development of capitalism, settler colonialism. That's all going on as if it's all rational. The Enlightenment, as if it is all necessarily a rational development, where this other part of human experience and sensibility of self gets sort of pushed over to the Gothic, and or finds its place in the Gothic, and you make this beautiful kind of connection to the way that mystical discourses like alchemy, mesmerism, animism, women's knowledge, madness, various kinds of things get kind of pushed over there into this kind of repository of the Gothic, which leaves this Gothic as, you say it so well, better than I can, because I can't mimic exactly what you said, but you say it leaves it somewhat unspeakable, because it isn't in that dominant discourse, but yet it is there kind of to be read. Yeah, I love that.
Well, this thing about the unspeakable, which is, it's difficult to speak of the unspeakable, because once you start speaking about it, it's not unspeakable anymore. But the thing is like Shoshana Fellman and Foucault, they talk about this phrase was resonating with me for so long, words without language. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what words? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, what the fact that, Freud was talking about. He said that there was something about psychoanalysis that owed a debt to the 17th century. And I thought, and he was concerned about a force, and I thought, what force is he talking about? And I mean, when we speak in literary studies, when we talk about poetry, you know, there are ways of speaking to this force when I say,
Yes.
you know.
Okay, yes.
And so
It may be easier actually for us when we study literature to understand that kind of quiet force, as it were.
yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because this is why I have to get into that's not what I meant at all.
Oh, that's not it at all.
Because as soon as I've spoken it, it
Yeah.
means that's not it. And so what I understood with regards to why alchemy has made its appearance here is, in the 19th century and into the 20th century, Freud and Jung had this, you know, epic clash. And so first of all, let us say of the clash that I saw these two figures as being almost spoken by, the clash of these worldviews that they, as you know, Jung himself has basically said, what I'm saying is not new, but it is this kind of basically a reemergence of something. And so the something for Jung was alchemy. And he understood, let's say, depth psychology, analytical psychology, as being modeled upon alchemy. The relationship between one's analyst and the person, you know, in analysis, is akin to the processes of alchemy. And then there are many writers now who are talking about writing as forms of alchemy, like David Abram. So, and you know, David Abram is, you know, really well known for his idea and what he calls the more than human world. And what we mean by the more than human world is it's this kind of calling attention to human exceptionalism and the idea, like coming for centuries, that there is this great, you know, chain of being, this hierarchy of being, in which ultimately it could manifest itself as a kind of mechanistic view of the world through that kind of science in which,
Through a kind of hierarchy.
yes, but also, and maybe even more significant, that nature, matter, was seen as being inert and devoid of life, the inanimate object. So that could jump us into Freud talking about how to ward off the uncanny as something that he said it's about previously surmounted thought. So therefore it's it's weird and interesting, but you know, we're not there anymore. And so it's about, he talks about the return of the repressed.
Like it is the return of our animal, the return of the repressed. He talks as if it is this return of something that we had to put outside of ourselves, this more related to nature self, more related to our, I'm not using animal in a sort of degradation sense, but in the sense of really, that's what he seems to think we had to repress, our relation to the larger nature, right?
Yes. You know, and I mean, you're saying so many things there that have sort of like I just want to follow them down, track them down. But, you know, there's a very subtle weaving of all of these discourses, and what I was aiming to do, and I will, you know, I'll know if it was successful or not, you know, when the book is read, I suppose. I mean, so let's put it this way. The thing was not only about challenging Freud, but it was challenging the institution of Freud, which
Right
is
on. Yes.
which is, you know, has been the purview of Gothic studies.
Absolutely.
And so Gothic studies has, you know, been reading Gothic texts so ubiquitously with regards to, you know, looking at the pathology and of the, you know, a certain kind of madness, a certain kind of Oedipal complex and castration, and oh, this is uncanny, and oh, that's uncanny. And I started thinking, one of the issues is also that some Gothic studies are so invested in Freud that we can't now see the forest for the trees.
Right. Yeah.
And so Jung comes in to this, my reading of Jung, and the theory of synchronicity, which he developed with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, they were really cutting edge here when this theory was being developed, because quantum mechanics and quantum theory comes up as an emergent branch of physics, which Einstein had referred to as the spooky side of physics, because there was things that happen in experimentation that were inexplicable, and that to say that old subject-object divide, I'm doing an experiment on this over here and that's what I'm looking at, you know, was really set on its head, because the uncertainty principle determined that what we're really looking at is that one cannot, the so-called object and the subject are enmeshed. It's called quantum entanglement at the level of the macro level. At the micro level or the subatomic level, quantum entanglement means sometimes you can have electrons, let's say, energy generated from electrons, and there will be a response from electrons. It could be on as far away as the moon, let's just say. So there's this sense of this entanglement, and for Jung, as he was working in, you know, in the psychological terrain, they began noticing or recording or writing about and thinking about the fact that people have these experiences that are inexplicable, and they're called synchronicities, not just, you know, this is not just a kind of, well, that was just coincidence, but rather synchronicities were a way of recognizing the fact of meaning being produced, in which, as Jung puts it, there comes a place where psyche and matter, there's an overlap in which they are inextricable, so that the world, let us just say, objects seem to act as if they are familiar with my psychological, mental, spiritual states, for that matter. So I'm sure everybody has had, you know, even small moments of synchronicity, and the response of psyche and matter in these other texts, like literary texts, because here I'm just talking about my engagement with the, you know, the world of ideas, and how this engagement led me to, you know, to work with Gothic in a way that seemed against the grain. I started reading about Jung and the Philosopher's Stone, which is, you know, intrinsic to alchemy. When we speak of consciousness, and those, as I alluded to earlier, that, you know, there are many forms of consciousness, but the attribution of only one kind of consciousness is, I think, instrumental in regards to the limitations of a system of thought that determines what can be thought within it.
Yes, absolutely.
And it creates its own limit to the extent that if one steps outside the limit, as if one could step outside, but if one steps outside, one is then deemed pathological, which is something
mad, crazy, yes.
Yeah, which is something that I address in one of the chapters about Eden Robinson's Monkey Beach. The protagonist, Lisa Marie, you know, you see her, you know, she's at the hands of the psychologist who is, you know, really suggesting that her experiences with spirits, with spirit, is something that, you know, will be rectified with a little, there, Lisa, you know, it is all about mourning. It is not about the fact that the spirit world is, you know, it may not be seen as being veridical, but it is real. And if it is real, and I'm not talking about let's do seances, I think that this is what, you know, they wanted to do in the 19th century, but if it is real, that should tell us something about what has been cordoned off in order that we can think the way
We do.
which gets us into the Anthropocene, does
Right,
it not?
absolutely,
Physics has already determined that there is something that the space itself has consciousness. That sounds sort of like, well, let's, get into sci-fi, but this is the one thing that Gothic scholar Frederick Frank said that I stumbled. Well, did I stumble upon it, or did it find me? But
that was really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and he says he's talking about the first Gothic novel, and he said it really upsets basically Newton's first law of motion, because that's the law in which there's a force and it moves the object, but the object has nothing to do with it. But he says, what this novel is doing is it gets us into thinking about what he refers to the supernatural, but he said that it's about the sentience of space and place. And I thought, oh my God, he said it, and he never mentions it again. It is nowhere else I could not find any reference to it in all of Gothic studies in the wide world. And I thought, the sentience of space and place, well, that first of all goes back to thinking about the way that the alchemists experience the world as having a relationship, and then my job when I try to talk about the Anthropocene is also to have it understood that the relationships that we have with our companion animals are no different than in regards their ontology than the lives of the 55 billion animals that are slaughtered every year. And so gets us back into the Anthropocene again, in which what we're talking about is the way that kind of factory farming has produced the kind of methane. It has produced unsustainable water use. It is about the forest, cutting of the forests in the Amazon global. There. And so if you look at this little dog, Max, see, he goes, I know my name. Max is he's a being, as is that bird up there, who is serenading us as we're doing our talk here. There's so much, and I really wish, I'm so grateful that you have, given such beautiful attention.
And I just really appreciated some of the insights, but not just into the Gothic, but into the way in which the Gothic, I like this idea of it being a repository for things that we need to understand if we are to understand the Anthropocene. So I'd like to, I need to bring our talk to a bit of a close. So there is a sentence, I always like to give our listeners a bit of a sense of some of the beauty of the prose, which means I want to slow down and read. It wouldn't necessarily be a line that Jodey chose, it's a line that I chose. The concept of mind may well be more than human. This is to say that Gothic is anathema to the mind-matter divide, and as a genre is more than just a spooky atmospheric story. Gothic relentlessly draws attention to an ontological error, a fault line, perhaps, in the perception that matter is inert or inanimate, and draws attention instead to the sense that physical objects are just one kind of object among many others. I think for many of you who are listening to us today, I hope you will look at Jodey's book, but I also hope you will take from this the importance of the kind of thinking that literature allows us in order to connect us to this place, to this environment, to this time that we're living in. And yeah, I thank you all for being here and joining us on this, I think it's our second of our Porch session.